And let me just tell these guys. All right. So let's pop open. James. James. Good. All right. So let's get started with this. This is a presentation we're going to look at, and then I'm going to go through some examples, introduce you to a couple of other tools that I think you're going to find useful. We were just talking about Testem. So again, this is if you want to write some tests pretty quickly, you could end up using that. Again, the key there is just to make sure that Testem, you have it installed globally. So you guys probably have run some NPM, you've run some NPM commands, whether or not how much you know about it, depends. Right now you might just be using it as a way of installing things, but we will end up talking a little bit more about what's happening and where things get installed. And I'm not terribly worried about the time because we don't need quite as much time, I think, for the workshop. I don't think the selected workshop is going to take as much time as it's allocated. There's not really a ton of code that's there. So make sure I'm on the. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the DOM, right? And what exactly the DOM is. Now, if you're you're comfortable with working with trees, like a binary search tree, then the DOM is just a tree. So what does the DOM stand for? I used to always pretend it was a guy named Dominic or something, but it's a document object model, right? And what ends up happening here is that when you end up loading your HTML, the JavaScript engine, the browser, creates a DOM. So your text gets turned into a tree, right? And you have access to the tree from JavaScript. You can look at this DOM, at this document, and you can traverse over this tree. And it's a tree, a down tree, starting HTML tag, and then in this case, within your HTML tag, you can have your head and your body. You could end up having div tags. From within the div tags, you could have other div tags. You could have an unordered list, which would have list items underneath it. And when we talk about traversing through the DOM, what we're talking about are nodes. And these nodes that are in the DOM are HTML elements. They could be composed of other HTML elements, right? So everything we traverse through the DOM, everything is one of these nodes. So one way to kind of think about this maybe is that the code that we write, this HTML, this text, is a blueprint which sort of comes to life in this house, okay? So this blueprint is very flat, like our text file is flat. When the browser ends up loading it, we now have something that we can work with, right? So how does it help us out? Well, so here's our HTML. We end up browsing to a web page. What do we end up getting back in the DOM? Right, it depends on what is in the HTML. So in this case, this would be, if we ended up breaking this down, we would see that this is one of the guys that was, I guess, ended up implementing the DOM. So one of these things that you see a lot is that these are specifications. There's a specification for how the DOM is supposed to work. And so browsers, and the specification says that when the web page loads, you should be able to access the DOM, you should be able to traverse the DOM, each of the nodes should be able to do this. So the specifications end up getting turned into implementation by the different browsers. Okay? When we talk DOM, we're talking about browsers. Okay? So this goes back quite a while. There used to be a term for dynamic HTML. I remember that. They don't really use that anymore. Sounds a little bit weird. So how does this end up happening, right? Again, like what we said before, we've got this text file, and at runtime, we end up getting this DOM object that we can manipulate. And the sort of thing to think about is that it's live, okay? And that's what makes dynamic HTML possible, right? That's the reason why these specifications were set up, to basically be able to modify a web page, the DOM. Now, what's sort of interesting, if you just sort of go back a long time, is how initially, before people were following this specification, different browsers ended up implementing things differently. So for instance, you would have to sort of sniff out, and at that time, there was really two browsers that people used, really going way, way back. They used Internet Explorer and Netscape. And literally, you would see code. It's still something I bet is still out there, where you would sniff to see what browser it was by looking at how the DOM was implemented. So you would say, hey, look, one of the things that I mentioned before, and this is just a JavaScript thing, is that it's perfectly legitimate to query a JavaScript object. So there's access to the DOM is done through the document object. There's this document object, and the implementation says when you use the word document, you're going to be accessing your DOM, okay? Again, different browsers can end up implementing it differently, but you have this object, and the point is that different vendors implemented things differently, and it's perfectly legitimate to query an object. So you could say if document.layers, okay? If your DOM knew what a layer was, okay? If layers were defined in your DOM, that meant that you had Netscape. That's how people would end up sniffing these things out. Now, browsers are a lot better at implementing the spec, so it's a little bit less of an issue.
Why couldn't we just skip the HTML part and write it like the second column?
Why couldn't you skip the HTML? You mean, why couldn't you have left out the HTML tags?
Well, maybe I'm a little confused as to what this is, but you know, it looks like the same type of information rendered two different ways, right?
No, one is a text file, okay, and one is an in-memory representation. And I think what this slide is showing is that, you know, this runtime is the in-memory representation. So the browser goes in, and in essence, you can think about the browser going in and parsing this text file and creating this structure in memory that you can then manipulate. So again, it's the idea of turning a text file into some living and breathing thing that at runtime.
I think the question though, the reference document object, how can we constrain the document object?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess the answer to that is you know, so your question is, why couldn't you just write your HTML in JavaScript syntax?
Yeah.
You can. Yeah.
Well, you can, you can't. I mean, you could. Yeah, I mean, you can't because the browsers themselves are displaying HTML, right? Browsers work with hypertext markup language. I mean, again, the idea initially, you know, things were pretty static. Right. So you would just have these tags that were there. I mean, I think you'd have to change the language of how browsers work. I mean, internally, I could write an API that would take some JSON file and create DOM elements with that JSON file. I could do that. But I think one really could make the case that the HTML is a little bit more verbose, but it's also a bit more readable. So
I think what a lot of people do too is you see a lot of people with the site is almost written completely in JavaScript, but the confusion comes in there. Well, yeah, why can't I write on JavaScript? Well,
you have to have a starting point.
Yeah, you could have an almost empty HTML, but what the JavaScript is doing, you look at it, it's just spitting out HTML, which then the browser renders.
Let's be a little bit, let's use our words a little bit carefully here, right? Instead of saying that it's spitting out HTML, let's say that instead is based on some JavaScript, the browser is manipulating the DOM. Because that's really what's happening, right? I mean, now you could say, well, you know, it's creating the whole page. It's creating everything. All I did was have one HTML tag here, there.
Yeah.
You had one HTML tag, right? You started from something, right? So it has to have something, and that's why you have to have some HTML somewhere within the process.
I think if you think about it like this, your browser is a runtime environment, and it has two APIs, right? JavaScript and HTML.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll take input from either one of those things as to how the DOM should look. But that's really what you're doing. It understands natively HTML, right? Or you can write like 1,000 lines of JavaScript to say, insert node, set the value of the inner HTML to this, or the value to this. But you still have to build it all.
Yeah, and let's also just say one other thing. There's another API. There's a couple of other APIs. There's CSS API. There's a XML, HTTP, so these are all basically specifications how the browsers should end up implementing these things. So what ends up happening here is that we end up getting this document object model. And so again, when I think what this is showing here is that this is a two-way process where you could end up manipulating if you end up manipulating the DOM, you're going to end up seeing the results, right? Because the result is going to be the manipulating of the DOM is, you could say it's dynamically changing the HTML. Again, if you ended up going and looking at your source code wouldn't change. But show you, I'll show you an example here where, in fact, your DOM is changing. And again, so your page ends up changing. So we end up getting this structure here. If we looked at this static page, we'd get a DOM that looked like this. And again, this is just telling you, giving you an idea of what this tree structure looks like. Let me just tell, Gabby asked if she should order pizza for lunch. Should I have her order pizza for lunch? Or should we do pizza for dinner? What should we do? Let's ask her for lunch. Maybe we'll get both. Huh? Why say no when someone asks if you want pizza? You know, it's not a bad idea. Okay. So this HTML ends up turning into this DOM. And in essence, you have this tree, right? And again, we know about trees. Now, this tree is different, okay? This tree it's not just a search tree. You're not just going down. You have the ability to go up. And you go in both directions. Not only have the ability to go up, you have the ability to go over, too, to get siblings and that sort of thing. So again, it's a different structure. So, you know, this is some implementation of how the DOM works. So again, this is where you would end up looking at specifications of how the DOM works. So I have to say, not that I end up looking at this all that often, but these are things that you could do with the DOM, and we'll talk about some of this. So one of these things that we'll show right off the bat is document, get element by ID, and some of these other things. And again, this will give you some kind of comfort zone in terms of working with the DOM. So let me just also pop up this So in Selector, what we're going to use is we're going to basically create a utility function. One of the things that you're often doing with when you're looking at the DOM, if you want to manipulate the DOM, you have to find out where in the DOM you want to manipulate. So a big part of, first you have to find, you want to insert something, you want to insert an unordered list. What's a silly example of this? I don't know, you build something where stock values end up changing, or something with chatting, or some mail, web-based mail thing. Something comes in, you want to change a list, right? We have to find that list to find out what you're going to change. Well, it used to be that you kind of had to dig around to find that you had to use unique IDs. The only way, there's basically 3 methods that the DOM natively implements to find things. There's a get element by ID, which returns 1 element. You're not supposed to have 2 elements with the same ID. There is get elements by tag name, which you could say, hey, look, give me all the divs. And again, it's kind of important to note, when you end up doing that, whenever you're dealing with these collections, they're array-like, right? They're not arrays, but it's pretty easy to turn them into arrays. You can iterate over them, okay? But if you really want to treat them as arrays, you have to turn them into arrays, which is, I'll show you, it's fairly simplistic. There's get element by tag name, get element by ID.
Class attribute.
Class.
I don't think the DOM natively implements, frankly, I think there's 2 ways to get things. I think that, so what happens is that, it would be nice to be able to get things based on a CSS selector. It might be nice to say, hey, look, you know what, there's a list item with get me all the list items with the class news, okay? Or get me the unordered list with the class current news, or stocks, or something like that. Or get me the second item in the unordered list with the class of current events, or something along those lines. Now, what other libraries have done is they've wrapped around the native DOM methods. And even sometimes, the way that you could find elements, maybe there was some browser that implemented finding things a little bit easier than other browsers do. So these libraries, there was a library early on called Prototype you could use Prototype to find things easier. Again, under the covers, at the lowest level, it's always the native DOM elements. That's all you have, okay? But these other libraries abstracted away from that, basically made it a little bit easier. So the library that became sort of the de facto library for this was jQuery. So jQuery was a big part of it was its DOM manipulation, okay? You want to find an element and remove it. The only way that the DOM lets you remove something is by going up to the parent and deleting the node that you want to delete. And internally, that's what jQuery does, but jQuery says use a selector, find what you want, and you can just call remove on it. So jQuery basically had this whole idea of letting you find things a lot easier, and we're going to do a little bit of jQuery, and being able to manipulate them. So, hey, look, go find this DOM and fade it out, okay? Do some animation on it. And again, you didn't worry about what the implementation was of it. You trusted jQuery. And jQuery was a very, very popular library. jQuery has sort of fallen out now because it's been replaced by these frameworks that do a lot more. jQuery was very limited. jQuery was great on one page by just manipulating one page, but it wasn't good at the idea of having a single page application. So these other libraries sort of sprang up, some that had some dependencies on jQuery, but those dependencies ended up getting removed. So this is what we're going to be doing in this lecture. I'm going to assign pairs. I'm going to have the folks that are working remotely, I'm going to have them work alone for now. And you might want to investigate, because I think it could be kind of helpful to do, even maybe when you're working here, is that there's a site called Cloud9. And with Cloud9, you could actually create a virtual environment incredibly easily. And you could share that environment. And it might be helpful if you guys have time to sort of play around with it, to set up an account and invite someone as a collaborator. And you guys could, I think it might be helpful because you could actually even, if we do have a situation where we can't come to class, you might be able to pair together outside of class. And it's just another thing, another tool that you could end up using. I've used Cloud9, it's free. There's some other things that you could work with as well. But it's just a collaboration tool where you don't have to be in the same room, but you could also, in essence, what it would allow you to do if you were using it together here is that at least you don't have to worry about something being on one machine. You'd be developing from the cloud, and then you could go and both use that, and you could push things up to GitHub. There's a GitHub integration, which is nice as well.
Is it like a VM?
It's a VM. That's exactly what it is. It's a cloud-based VM. Have you used it at all?
No, I'm looking at it now. It's cool.
Yeah, it's pretty. I used to use it. I was actually developing on a Chromebook, and I was totally fine building smaller applications with it. I thought it was pretty good. It's a very nice IDE. So one thing that I want to do here, and I'm going to throw this out, something else you could investigate. There's a library that exists called BrowserSync. So we know a little bit about Testum, right? So Testum is, a library that allows us to write tests and run our tests pretty quickly. There's another Node package called BrowserSync. And what BrowserSync will do a couple of different things. We could end up using it when we do Angular and Express when we have our own server. But BrowserSync will also pop open a server in your directory. So it'll start a server in your directory. And I think by default, it'll look for the index file in that directory. The cool thing about BrowserSync is that, and I'll show you the command that I use, once it's installed, the only thing I have in this directory is an index file. So the BrowserSync command, once it's installed, let me make this bigger so folks can see this. The command that you use is you tell BrowserSync, and again, you have to install it globally. If you didn't, you could install it locally, but you have to run a little bit differently if you install it locally. You install it globally, npm install BrowserSync with a G, and you say BrowserSync start. The flag server says you want to start a server, and index.html says, hey, look, whenever index.html changes, reload the browser. And if you say, well, boy, that's kind of magic how it's doing that, what ends up happening is that when BrowserSync serves your file, it sticks a little HTML in there, which is a WebSocket. And so there's a WebSocket, so your browser is listening to your server, and your server basically says, hey, look, there was a change in index.html, reload it. So if I run this, and you don't have to do it for this, but it's another thing to play around with when you start getting towards the whole and developing. It's just one other tool that could make your life a little bit easier. And so if I run this, it'll actually open up my browser. It automatically opens it up into port 3000. So if I open up my console here, you can see that this is my console.log. Let me actually bring up my code. Again, it's always nice to, I think, get exposed to some of these packages that are out there. There's some other ones too. There's something called Live Reload, which probably does something pretty similar. And I'm going to give myself a little more room to work. Okay, so here's my HTML. And the only thing that I'm getting at here is that I have the ability to say document get element by ID heading, right? If in fact I didn't have an ID with heading, so let's pretend that I changed this. So if I go back here, it automatically reloads. This is nice. I just don't have to hit the refresh button, which is kind of cool. But the point is that when you use document get element by ID, if it doesn't find what you're looking for, you get basically a null value back. Just to show you a couple of really simple DOM methods. So let's say I have an unordered list here on the page. And I could go over here and I could say my unordered list is document get element. Let's try our other one. We're using both of these, by the way, in the workshop. Get elements by tag name, UL. Console.log, UL. You guys like that browser thing? It's pretty cool, right? Okay, so let's actually look at what you end up getting back here. You get something that sure as hell looks like an array, right? Feels like an array. So let's go over here and see if, let's say, how do we tell if something is an array? What is it? Is it array? I always forget this. Array is array? Or object is it? Array is array UL. Right, it looks like an array. Yeah, okay. How about if we say, feels like an array, right? Console.log UL 0. Let's actually call this list. Because don't forget, it's plural, get elements by tag name, and I'll say list 0. Seem to find what I was looking for here, right? But it's not quite an array. What methods do arrays have? It was an array, and I said well, length has an array, right? How about push? Undefined. Again, I always say this to folks, but don't forget, JavaScript is very kind. You can access things that don't exist. Just don't try to do anything with it. Inquiring about push is okay. Just don't try to push. It doesn't exist, right? Then you get an error. So just sort of in terms of how the DOM gets manipulated, I also just want to point something else out. This script works if it's on the bottom of the page, underneath where my unordered list is, because scripts run in order. Okay? Script blocks will run as your HTML loads. Okay? Script blocks end up loading one at a time. So if I top as expected, okay? And there are ways to say, hey, I only want this thing to run when my DOM is finished loading. There's events that we could use on the DOM. We don't need them for this workshop, but I just wanted to throw this out to just show you that you could do something like this. So here's our list. Let's say I did want to turn this list into an array. There's an interesting method, which is, or a way to do this, which is to say array dot prototype. And I'm going to call the slice method. Okay? So the slice method will create an array from another array. Okay? And we'll end up using slice a little bit later on. But if you ended up going in and had an array of 3 values, and you said slice 0, it would give you the entire array back. It would figure I'm starting at 0, I'm getting everything. If you said slice 0, 1, it would give you the first element back. And there's even some ways to go backwards as well. But what I want to point out to you is that if we say array.prototype.slice, and we call that method, okay, and the context of that method is going to be on our list, okay? So again, call basically specifies the context, okay? But if we call it and we say, hey, look, just give me at the first element. So slice will actually work on arrays or anything that is enumerable. And our list is enumerable, it just isn't an array. It just is not an array. And if I do that, what do I get back? So if I do a console.log list array, here's my unordered list, and let me now ask if that's an array. Well, an easy way is push defined. Yeah, I screwed up. Thanks. push is a function. So again, if you have something array-like and you want to turn it into an array, a couple of ways you could do it. You could iterate over it because again, that collection, and it's called it. What that basically is, it's called a DOM list. Okay, it's array-like in that it has a length, and if something has a length, it has a length, and you can access elements with an index. Okay, but it's not an array. It's a little bit of an array. Okay,
It's just like the arguments of.
that's exactly right. So if you wanted to turn the arguments object into an array, you could do it, and that's the way that you would do it. That's exactly right. So this is something, a couple of things that I'm looking at here is, again, the idea of, you could use browser sync a little bit, and just the idea that you have the ability. We haven't manipulated the DOM. If we did want to manipulate the DOM, I guess we could say list array, how about this? I'll create a list item, document, create element, and this is all very, very sort of low level. These are the native DOM methods. A library like JavaScript makes this incredibly easy. Excuse me, I hate when a library like jQuery makes this very easy. So I'm going to create a list element, and I'm going to set the, this is a little bit strange too. You could create a text element. Now let's try this. I'm going to say list item dot, see if I still remember this, inner HTML equals foo. And I'm going to say list array is 0, which is my unordered list. 10 child, list item. I think there's a create element. I think there's also a create text node. And if that works, I should see foo pop up here, which it does. Okay. Well, again, all you see here is the ability, and we're not doing this for this workshop. What we're doing, let's actually talk about what selector is going to do. What selector is going to do is instead of having, if I have a H1 and I have a class of my H1, selector is going to allow us to do something like this by using the $sign. I'll just call this object. And I'm going to be able to say $sign and put in here a class. Or I'm going to be able to use a tag to get all of my links, okay? Or a tag followed by a class to get something else. So we're going to create, what we're going to do in pieces, we're going to create this $sign function, okay, which is going to lead us through the path of some functional programming. And just, again, it's just basically following the instructions. And one of the things that you should be able to do here is when you end up downloading this repo, which I'll set up, you should be able to open up that folder. I tend to like to opening things up as servers as opposed to files. So you could either use browser sync, or there's another module that just doesn't reload automatically, but there's another module called HTTP server. And what that does is just pops up a server. It doesn't open it automatically, and it doesn't do any syncing. But if you go to this address, you'll end up getting your files. And here I'm getting some errors here. I think by default, if there's an index file, it ends up opening up the index file. So this broadcast. So you guys remotely, what I'm going to do is you guys could, once I open this up, you could start it on your own. And for the folks here, I'm going to set up some pairs for them.